Most people think trauma is something rare, something that only happens to soldiers or victims of horrific events. But what if trauma is far more ordinary? What if it's in the way you were ignored as a child, the way you had to hide your emotions just to feel safe? Or the way you've learned to smile when you're dying inside? And what if our culture, our fast-paced, numbing, productivity-obsessed world, is actually built on unprocessed trauma? We live in a society that medicates disconnection, rewards burnout, and calls it success, where millions are quietly addicted, anxious, depressed, and silently screaming for relief. Dr. Gabor Maté calls it the myth of normal. And today we're going to uncover the invisible wounds most people carry and how they shape your relationships, your habits, and your sense of self. Because the real question isn't, what's wrong with me? It's, what happened to me? And why did I have to forget it just to survive? This isn't just a conversation, it's an invitation to see yourself clearly for the first time in years and to finally begin healing. If you've ever felt like something inside you was missing, you're not alone. And this is where the journey back to wholeness begins. Trauma is a word we throw around a lot these days, but most of us misunderstand what it really means. It's not just about war, violence, or catastrophic events. Trauma doesn't always leave visible scars. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's what didn't happen that leaves the deepest wound. Dr. Gabor Maté defines trauma simply: it's not what happened to you, it's what happened inside you as a result. It's the wound, not the weapon. The disconnection, not the event. Think of a child who's constantly told to stop crying, be good, or toughen up. That child isn't learning emotional regulation. They're learning that their emotions are unsafe, that who they are is unacceptable. And so they disconnect from themselves, not by choice, but by necessity. That's trauma. It's the survival instinct that says, hide your feelings, numb your needs. Disappear who you really are, just to stay close to the people you depend on. And it doesn't go away with age. It stays in your body, in your nervous system, in your relationships. It shows up in addiction, perfectionism, chronic illness, and the quiet belief that you're not enough. It often goes unnoticed because we've built a society that praises overfunctioning, self-denial, and emotional suppression. We call it ambition, independence, discipline. But it's not health, it's adaptation. Dr. Maté says most trauma is developmental. It happens not from cruelty, but from emotional neglect. Not because our parents didn't love us, but because they were stressed, overwhelmed, or carrying their own trauma. And when our core emotional needs aren't met, we adapt by fragmenting who we are. That's not weakness, that's intelligence. But if we don't go back and meet those needs in adulthood, we don't heal. We just repeat. Addiction is one of the most misunderstood experiences in our society. We see it as weakness, a lack of discipline, a personal failing. But Dr. Gabor Maté urges us to see it for what it really is, a coping mechanism, a solution, not the core problem. Don't ask, why the addiction, he says. Ask, why the pain? Every addictive behavior, from heroin to alcohol, shopping to porn, workaholism to food, starts the same way, with pain that feels unbearable and no other tools to cope with it. Addiction is relief. Temporary, yes, but often the only relief a person knows. Theo reflects on his own struggles. It gave me a break. From me. From how I felt. That's it. That's the essence of addiction. Not chasing pleasure, but escaping pain. Maté explains how the brain chemicals behind addiction, dopamine and endorphins, are not defects. They're part of our biology. Dopamine gives us energy, purpose, vitality. Endorphins soothe pain, foster connection, and make love possible. When we don't get emotional connection as children, our brains stop producing these chemicals naturally. So we go looking for them externally, in drugs, in sex, in applause, in numbing. Dr. Maté himself once spent thousands in a single day on classical music CDs. Not because he needed more music, but because of the high, the sense of presence it gave him. It made him feel alive. Addiction, he says, isn't about what you're addicted to. It's about why you need to be numb. It's a response to trauma, an intelligent adaptation to an environment that didn't meet your needs. That doesn't make it sustainable, but it does make it understandable. And if we can understand addiction not as a moral failure, but as a wounded cry for safety, we can finally begin to offer something better than judgment. We can offer healing. You can be in a crowded room surrounded by laughter, affection, even praise, and still feel alone. That's the curse of unprocessed trauma. It convinces you that you're separate, even when you're embraced. Dr. Maté explains that trauma doesn't just wound the psyche, it fractures connection, not just with others, but with yourself. When you were a child and your pain was ignored, dismissed, or punished, you learned a hard truth. Don't show who you are. It's not safe. So you hid your anger, you buried your sadness, you smiled when you were breaking, and you grew up with a mask so convincing, even you forgot it was there. But no matter how well you perform, that buried pain doesn't disappear. It isolates you. You end up emotionally alone, even in relationships, even in success, even in recovery. Dr. Maté references a US Surgeon General report. Loneliness is now an epidemic. It increases your risk of disease, mental illness, and even death. It's as damaging to your body as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Why? Because we are wired for connection. We need others the same way we need food, shelter, and sleep. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. When that need isn't met, we don't just feel lonely, we become sick. Theo opens up about his experience. Sometimes I'm around people I love, and I still feel like I'm not really there. Like there's a fog. That fog is trauma, and it won't clear until we stop pretending we're fine and start telling the truth. We heal in connection. When someone sees past our mask and says, "You don't have to hide anymore, I'm here." But until we give ourselves permission to be seen, we'll remain surrounded and starving. Because the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. Shame is a silent force that shapes how we see ourselves long before we understand who we are. Theo puts it plainly. I felt ashamed of my ears, my face, even the way I stood. I felt like I was gross, like, down to my first molecule, there was something wrong with me. Dr. Maté listens quietly and then makes a crucial distinction. That's not a feeling, that's a belief. You weren't born ashamed, no one is. Shame is something you learn when the people who were supposed to make you feel safe and valued couldn't. Not because they didn't love you, but because they were overwhelmed, distracted, or wounded themselves. As a child, you don't think, Mom is emotionally unavailable. You think, there must be something wrong with me. Why? Because children are narcissistic, not in the selfish sense, but developmentally. They think everything that happens is because of them. So when a parent is emotionally distant, angry, or absent, the child doesn't question the adult, they question themselves. And they come to one crushing conclusion: if I were different, I'd be loved. That belief becomes shame. And shame doesn't whisper, it infects. It tells you you're not enough, that you're unlovable, that you have to prove your worth, perform your value, and hide your true self. Theo recalls thinking, I didn't even know I existed. And when he did begin to exist, it was only through the gaze of others. Shame robs you of your birthright. to feel whole without earning it. Dr. Maté says healing begins the moment you realize this. You were never gross, never broken, never fundamentally wrong. You just didn't get the message you were supposed to get from the beginning. You are enough, simply because you are. And it's not too late to hear it now. At some point, many of us stop being who we are and start becoming who we think we need to be. Theo puts it in stark, almost childlike terms. Sometimes I feel like I was something my soul created to survive, like a puppet. And that metaphor cuts deep. Because when we grow up in environments where our emotions aren't welcome, where our true selves are met with silence, ridicule, or rejection, we learn to shape-shift. We craft a version of ourselves that will be accepted, applauded, loved, not for who we are, but for who we pretend to be. Dr. Maté nods knowingly. Do you remember the story of Pinocchio? When he becomes a real boy, he looks back at his puppet self and says, "I was so foolish." That's what trauma does. It turns real people into puppets. Strings pulled by survival instincts. Faces painted with performance. And the tragedy. Sometimes we become so good at playing that role, we forget there was ever someone else underneath. We call it personality, success, drive, humor, but it's not identity, it's adaptation. The puppet isn't a lie, it was necessary. It kept you alive when being authentic felt dangerous. But the danger has passed, and yet the puppet remains. So how do we become real again? We begin by noticing when we're acting, by feeling when we're disconnected, by asking, is this really me or the version I created to be safe? Dr. Maté reminds us. That disconnection is the trauma. Healing isn't becoming someone new, it's returning to who you were before the world taught you to hide. And the moment you cut those strings, even just one, you're not a puppet anymore, you're human. And that's the most courageous thing you can be. We often talk about parenting as a personal responsibility. But what if that's only half the truth? Dr. Gabor Maté says something that shakes the modern model of child rearing. We didn't evolve to parent in isolation. Yet today, that's exactly what we do. Two overworked parents, or often just one, racing between jobs, bills, school drop-offs, and barely enough time to breathe, all while carrying their own unresolved trauma. And we expect them to raise emotionally secure, fully present, healthy children. That's not parenting, that's survival. In traditional cultures, children were raised not by one or two adults, but by a tribe. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, all contributed. There was no work-life balance because life was the village. Children were constantly held, touched, nurtured, not spoiled, seen. Theo reflects, I don't think my mum ever really looked at me, not because she didn't care, she just had too much on her plate. That's the quiet wound in so many homes. The love was there, but the presence was missing. And what happens to a child who isn't seen? They grow up needing to be seen. And that need becomes a script. Perform, achieve, please. Never just be. Dr. Maté explains, children don't just need food and shelter. They need emotional resonance. They need attunement. They need to feel felt. But our society prioritizes performance over presence, behavior over bonding, outcomes over connection. Even our schools mirror this. Kids sit still, follow rules, suppress emotion, and we call that success. But what children need is play, safety, space to be themselves without being managed into submission. Until we remember the village and recreate it, even in small ways, we will keep mistaking obedience for health and raising children who feel just as alone as their parents. Trauma begins in disconnection, and healing begins in the opposite, connection, not in perfection, not in performance, but in the raw, honest, trembling space where one person looks at another and says, "I see you." Dr. Maté says, "We don't heal through insight alone. We heal when it's safe enough to stop pretending." That safety doesn't come from intellect, it comes from relationships. Theo shares a powerful moment from his recovery, sitting in a 12-step group, surrounded by strangers, and for the first time, feeling less alone. Not because anyone had the answers, but because everyone had the courage to tell the truth. That's where healing starts, not when you fix everything, but when you stop hiding. Maté emphasizes that even the best therapies won't work if the core conditions aren't present. Safety, compassion, presence. Without that, people don't open. They perform, they manage, they stay locked inside their pain. He recalls working with severely addicted individuals in Vancouver, many with harrowing pasts. But underneath the addiction was always the same cry, "Please, let me be seen without shame." Sometimes all it took was one conversation where no one judged them, where someone said, "You're not bad, you're hurt." And in that moment, something shifted. Psychedelics, therapy, group work, these can be catalysts, but they're not the cure. The cure is integration, connection, continuity, the daily decision to stop running from yourself and to start turning toward your truth. Healing is not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering the self you abandoned to survive. And the beautiful truth is that self is still in there, waiting to be welcomed home. When you look around at the world today, at the division, the burnout, the violence, the rising despair, it's easy to wonder, is it too late to change any of this? Dr. Gabor Maté doesn't think so. He believes healing is possible, not just for individuals but for society. But only if we're willing to stop numbing, stop blaming, and start remembering what we've lost. And what we've lost, he says, is each other. We've built a culture obsessed with independence. We glorify individual success, but real human flourishing, it was always rooted in interdependence. He tells stories of indigenous communities where the sick are embraced, not isolated, where a person's pain is seen as a message for the whole village, not something to fix, but something to honor. When someone got sick, he says, the tribe would thank them. Your pain is showing us what needs to be healed in all of us. Imagine that. Instead of saying, "What's wrong with you?" we said, "Thank you for revealing where we're out of balance." What if healing wasn't a private, shameful journey, but a shared one? Theo reflects on this. Sometimes I think all of us are just screaming inside, waiting for someone to notice. And maybe that's true. But Maté offers hope. More and more people are noticing. People are waking up to their pain, questioning the systems that created it, and seeking something more than surface-level fixes. The path isn't easy, but it's possible. And it starts with each of us asking, how can I live in a way that honors my needs and the needs of others? How can I help rebuild the village I never had? Because healing isn't just personal, it's political, it's relational, it's spiritual, and it's already happening, one honest conversation at a time. If there's one message that echoes through this entire conversation, it's this. You are not broken, you're not lazy, not weak, not defective. You are a human being, shaped by circumstances you didn't choose, forced to adapt in ways that made sense at the time, and now, quietly longing to come home to yourself. Dr. Gabor Maté reminds us that healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about reclaiming the self that had to go into hiding. The part of you that was never wounded, never corrupted, just buried beneath years of shame, performance, and silence. Trauma makes us forget who we are. Healing helps us remember. Theo reflects on this with a soft honesty. I think I used to be a figment of survival, something I built just to make it. But now I want to find out who I really am. Maybe you're there too. Maybe you've worn the mask so long, you don't remember what your face looks like underneath it. Maybe you've mistaken your coping for your character, your armor for your identity. But somewhere in you there's a voice that says, this isn't all there is. And that voice is right. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. You don't need to perform to be worthy. You don't need to fix yourself before you deserve peace. You need only one thing, the courage to turn inward and stay. Because on the other side of that pain, that fear, that numbness, is not destruction. It's freedom. So take a breath. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be. And listen, you're not alone, and you never were.